Hi, welcome to our show, It's Not the Same Without the Sand. My name is Irene Sprague-Davis, and I am your host and Trustees of Sandwich Beaches. Our show is dedicated to informing the public about the problem of erosion on our coastline. And today we're going to be talking about the impact of erosion on both our environment, both our ecological environment as well as the business environment. My first guest today is Tara Nye, and Tara has a master's degree in biology and works at the Association to Protect Cape Cod. She's been there for 10 years, and in fact she is a specialist in saltwater marshes. Welcome, Tara.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit about what the Association to Protect Cape Cod is all about. What are your activities?
We are, first of all, an Association to Preserve Cape Cod.
Thank you.
We are a 44-year-old nonprofit environmental organization, the oldest regional organization on Cape Cod, member supported, and our activities are incredibly wide-ranging. We do everything from looking at zoning bylaws to counting river herring to salt marsh monitoring. So we have a very wide range of programs that we carry out on the Cape.
Now, in terms of the marsh obviously is a very important part of our ecosystem. I wonder if you could kind of touch upon for the folks who are watching today about what the functions of the marsh are.
Unlike APCC, the functions of the marsh are incredibly wide-ranging as well. The marshes provide habitat for all sorts of wildlife, nesting and breeding, feeding grounds for birds, habitat and nurseries for shellfish and finfish. In fact, roughly 75% of all commercially important species, fish and shellfish species, have some point of their life are spent in the salt marsh.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and they also provide storm surge protection and floodwater protection.
And that's a great segue into some of the issues that we're talking about on the show. I know I've mentioned to you that we are seeing the marsh get flooded at a much higher rate, more frequent, to a greater degree. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you think that might do to this very important structure, the marsh.
Well, let's talk a little bit first about what a marsh does. The natural process of a marsh is when the water comes in at high tide, the grasses in the marsh trap the sediment that's floating in the water at high tide, and it brings it down to the surface of the marsh. And so you get this building up of the marsh surface. And so when you have, that's a normal process that happens at every high tide. So I'm sorry, can you repeat what the...
So I want to know what the impact, if this is a really important structure and the structure is there to try to help with mitigating some of the storm surges,
right.
What happens when we get this continual flooding that may be above what's natural?
So, okay, so that's the normal process that happens at high tide when you get the sediments being trapped by the grasses. But when you have a more frequent or higher flooding than normal, the marsh surface or the marsh system maybe will not have time to adapt to that inundation of water at high tide. And so if you can't get the surface of the marsh to accrete at a fast enough rate, then you'll end up with a salt marsh that's flooded more frequently than it can handle.
And when you say accrete, you mean build up?
Yes, the surface of the marsh elevates, it builds up over time. That's just a normal process that the salt marsh undergoes.
Now, I've heard the marsh being referred to as a large sponge.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's one of the things when I was saying that it's a good storage for floodwaters. The sponge concept is actually kind of twofold. One, in the sense of water. If you have a lot of water coming into the surface of the marsh, first of all, for one thing, the surface of the marsh is incredibly flat and broad. So if you spill a little bit of water, for example, on this table, it's going to spread across the surface of the table very well. If it were a hill or a little depression, you'd get a very different kind of concept of how that water is going to take over this area. So that's one way, just by literally acreage, flat surface, water comes in, it stores it very well. But there's also the concept of like a sponge in the sense that the peat, the surface of the marsh, is very porous and it can hold a lot of water, literally like a sponge. And then there's another concept too about the sponge. When you have a lot of nutrients or pollutants from the surface, you know, the roads, the parking lots, and they're coming into the marsh, it also acts as a sponge to absorb and retain those sediments and nutrients coming off of the runoff from the land.
So what happens when there are numerous homes that are along the marsh and they have septic systems? What happens when those septic systems get flooded? You know, how much can the marsh absorb?
Every marsh is different. Every situation is different. Depends on how many homes, how many septic systems, how well the septic systems are working, how frequently they're pumped out. So it's not such a simple answer, unfortunately, but initially, basically, a salt marsh can absorb a lot of that. It's very good at that. That's one of the great functions of a salt marsh, a healthy salt marsh, is it can absorb those nutrients that are coming in from the septic system. But if you have too much, or if you have too much flooding of a septic system, then the salt marsh, it can't take that, it can't tolerate that, and the nutrients or the toxins that are coming from the septic system will ultimately harm the salt marsh.
And so when you talk about those toxins, it makes me wonder about the toxicity of the water that the kids are swimming in. I'm sure that's tested. Is that tested? How regularly is that tested?
The town tests any public beach area, anywhere people are swimming, the town tests. I don't know what the frequency is. I'm not sure if it's weekly or daily. And they're looking for nutrients. They're looking for bacteria counts. If the bacterial counts get too high, they close the beach down. Or if it's a shellfishing area, they'll close the shellfish beds down so you can't take shellfish from the area. One thing that they do not test for, that most places can't, it's cost prohibitive, and sometimes the tests aren't even readily available, is to test for some of those toxins. So those toxins, so things that are coming out of a septic system that aren't nutrient-based aren't tested for.
Like such as?
Such as pesticides, or such as, we call them, well, there's actually lots of different names for them.
I think one of the things that you talked about at one point when we were discussing this earlier was some of the pharmaceuticals that might end up in the
I was thinking
system.
of endocrine disruptors, which is a much bigger word but pharmaceuticals, lots of pharmaceuticals in the septic system that that will come out into the salt marsh, or into, you know, if a septic system is flooded on a regular basis, or if it isn't properly maintained.
Boy, and that's not something that we typically think about. We don't think about pharmaceuticals being in our water.
It's sort of a new concept, I mean, it certainly isn't new, but it's in terms of being on the forefront of people's brains, it's very new. A lot of people aren't thinking about it.
Now, I have seen some of the marsh sort of break away, and I know that watching it through the years of when I was growing up to what I see now, it seems as though we're losing some of that marsh. Is that a natural process? Do we need to worry about that?
It is a natural process for parts of the bank of the salt marsh to break off and to break in. It's if you see it at an accelerated rate, then yeah, it's something we definitely need to be worried about.
Because that's not something we can get back.
Right, the peat, the parts of the marsh that break off, the peat of the marsh, it takes years, hundreds of years to build up that peat. So right, that's not coming back in a couple days or a couple years, a couple hundred years.
Yeah. How about the plant life? Is that affected by having this overflooding, overwashing of the marsh?
The vegetation, the plants in a salt marsh are incredibly fascinating, especially to a biologist like myself, but there's a wide range of plants that can exist in a salt marsh. When you have the edges of the salt marsh that are right next to the creek water that are regularly flooded by high tide, that's a certain kind of plant that lives along that bank. It can tolerate being flooded daily, monthly, but as frequently as daily, because it has the ability to excrete salt on its leaves, so it can tolerate that. But if you move away from the bank, the plants that grow further away can't tolerate that.
Right.
So if you had too much flooding of a marsh, you're going to get a very specific, maybe even only this one kind of plant that can grow, that can tolerate that. So you go from a very diverse salt marsh with lots of various plants in it to a salt marsh with just less diversity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the other issues with this erosion is that we're getting these breakthroughs through the dunes, and much of the sand from the barrier beach is coming into the creek. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. We know it's a bad thing for the dunes because we're losing the dunes, we're losing the height of the dunes, they're very flat, and now we have, it's been counted up to 5 breaks and breaches in this dune system. But what does that do for the salt marsh?
Having an inundation of sand or sediment is not necessarily a bad thing for a marsh. It, in fact, needs sand and sediment in order for the surface to accrete, in order for it to maintain a healthy system. But an important part of this particular system here in Sandwich is that your dune, you need this healthy dune system. I mean, it's just part of the way that that system works. And so your first defense, I think this is something that you'll touch on. The first defense for any sort of flooding is a healthy dune system, a healthy beach system.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So we've talked a lot in a past couple of shows about how important it is for kids to stay off the dunes. But what about the marshes? We actually see people standing on the edge of the marshes. And as a child, I used to have mud fights. We would go and grab that mud and we'd smear it on each other and throw it at each other. Do you think it's just as important to keep people off the salt marshes? Yeah,
absolutely. And that's one of the best parts about this salt marsh is the boardwalk. You can be almost literally on the surface.
That's true.
And you know, appreciate the marsh from that perspective. In fact, that could also have some sort of impact on the edges of the marsh. If people are standing on the edges of the marsh, it's a little fragile of a system, and that could also be causing some of the bits and chunks to break off. But yeah, it's a good idea not to walk on the surface of the marsh. I'm on the surface of a marsh across the Cape on a regular basis, and I actually see the impacts of people being on the marsh. So it is.
What do you see?
Trails.
Yeah.
You see, the surface of the marsh is very flat, and you'll see a depression, you know, from literally people walking along the same area, the same trail. So it is a fragile system that should be treated as such, just like the dunes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for enlightening us about that. We are now going to bring in our next guest, who will be Kate Bavelock, and Kate is the Executive Director of the Chamber of Commerce. Okay, our next guest is Kate Bavelock, and Kate is the Executive Director of the Sandwich Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Irene. Thanks for having me.
Sure. I thought maybe we could start by telling the public about what the Chamber of Commerce is all about. What is your mission, and what kind of activities are you involved in?
Well, our mission is to promote a healthy business, a healthy local economy through our businesses, our member businesses. We represent about 275 businesses in Sandwich and the surrounding area. And so they pay the membership dues to be part of an association. We're truly an association. I'm the spokesperson at the moment, but you know, we work collectively on all the things we try to do to promote business in Sandwich.
So in terms of the erosion, certainly there are lots of businesses that could be affected by flooding. You know, we've talked about the 100-year storm, which was in 1898, and that we're overdue for a 100-year storm. And in the last 100-year storm, there were actually buoys left on the steps of the town hall. So, I mean, that's a big, big event, but we also have smaller events that is really, I think, causing problems with some of the businesses along 6A. How many businesses, do you have any sense of how many businesses there are in that area?
You know, I didn't do a count. There's probably several dozen. If you look at along 6A and that stretch from Tupper to you know, a little bit further down, and then some of the Jarvis Main Street, those businesses. There's probably 2 to 3 dozen.
I mean, we're talking about Merchant Square.
Correct.
In that area.
I forgot Merchant Square.
Merchant
You're
Square,
right. That has another dozen right there.
And then
so
we
you're getting
have
up to 50 to 70, maybe.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And then we have that area that's along 6A, that whole area.
Correct.
We have the town.
Correct.
You know, downtown along Jarvis Street. and all along Main Street. We're talking about Daniel Webster. And anyone that's taken a kayak from the ocean through the creek, you can actually kayak all the way up, almost to the Doll Museum.
Correct.
So, I mean, that is the flow of water.
Yeah. Yeah, and see, I wasn't thinking about Merchant Square. I was thinking that of the most vulnerable area does seem to be right around Brady's Island and where the water comes up into the village. The 6A was built right across
It was.
the wetlands when it was put through. And that to me is probably the most vulnerable area.
Yes.
But I do hear from the businesses, I hear the concern. They're aware of the possibility. They already struggle with certain issues. Like you said, it's not just when the big one comes, it's more a lot of little ones already are affecting them. And then they have the fear of what happens when, you know, we do get a big storm that comes through and brings water into the village. The concerns right now, there's issues like wet basements, and it's very hard to lease a space or to keep your inventory if your building's wet. There are issues of septic failures in that area because there's such a high groundwater, and to build an above-ground septic system starts at $60,000,
Wow.
which for a small business owner is very, very difficult. I know the town is looking at wastewater solutions, and that's, you know, a key area because of the high groundwater. But you know, the barrier beach is another part of, you know, keeping that water out of the village that affects the septic systems as well. So.
And I don't mean to be alarmist, but you know, one of the things that I know the Chamber is trying to do is to attract new businesses to our area. Mm-hmm. Do you think that, you know, people seeing the beach and seeing the erosion and seeing the flooding, do you think that's having any kind of impact on, or do people consider that when they think about coming to Sandwich?
I think if they have been around for a while, they might be thinking about that. I think it's more that when they go to look at a space and they see water in the basement, or they see septic issues, tight tanks, that kind of thing, that they're discouraged from coming into town. So it's more the conditions on the ground than any kind of fear of the future that I think is keeping business, you know, creating empty spaces where there should be thriving businesses.
Right. So I guess I'd like to spin this a little bit different way now. I'd like to talk about how, if we can restore the beaches, mm-hmm. and Terry, you talked about how important that dune system is in order to protect our salt marshes and to protect our town. What do you think the impact of that can be? Do you think that's going to help us in terms of our salt marshes? And well, I'll ask you first. I mean, what impact will it have if we can control that erosion and that flooding?
You'll have, well, ultimately you'll be able to keep the water from flooding as much. I mean, the first defense against any kind of flooding is a healthy beach, healthy dune system. And then your second defense is your healthy salt marsh. And so if you can keep those or regain healthiness in the beach, in the dune system, and then of course the salt marsh is quite healthy, so if we just can maintain the health of that salt marsh, then we have very good defense against storm surges.
How about from the business standpoint? You know, I see, to me it's not even just the erosion, it's kind of bringing the beach back mm-hmm. to what it was mm-hmm. years ago. So what do you think that could do? Well,
tremendously important. I mean, tourism is still our #1 source of revenue, right. As a community. And, you know, there's people that have looked at bringing more technology to the Cape and developing other, you know, other industries, but really tourism is still it for us. And we live or die by what the tourists bring in, the revenue. And in order to have people come here and return here, we need to have attractive beaches, well-maintained, you know, the issues about the boardwalk stairs and those kinds of things, making sure those were fixed. Those are so tremendously important to us, that we have nice beaches with amenities, and we are, you know, not in danger of losing that. And if we lose that, people are going to choose another community with nice beaches to go to. And then the other part of that, which we touched on, is you know, we're talking a lot about protecting our historic district, and that's the other piece of visitors are coming to see our historic sites and our assets, and we need to protect them and preserve them, and this is a very important thing we need to look at in order to do that.
Kate, you touched upon sort of making our beaches attractive, and I think that's really important. I think, you know, we talk about protecting the salt marshes and getting the dunes back, but I think that you know, bringing our beaches back, having a bathhouse that might have maybe a small restaurant that has a great view. I mean, look at that view, it'd be beautiful. You know, we had beach dances when I was a kid, you know, for the kids, every Saturday night in the summertime, and it was awesome. So I think that those kinds of things probably could attract people. I know that, you know, I live on the beach, and I've heard people who come to visit say, these beaches are just not the same as they were before. You know, you walk on the beaches at high tide, and there's no beach almost at times, right? You've been down there when it's a flood tide. So I think that turning this around can have a much bigger impact than we can even imagine. I mean, both from the ecological standpoint, the business standpoint. I think that if we have a healthy and thriving coastline, that's really going to help us with our tourism and, again, attracting businesses.
Correct. Yeah.
So I think that we certainly can make a positive change here. I'm just wondering if you think we're at a critical point. Just like to get your input on that. Do you think we're at a critical point?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I don't think it's gone so far that it can't, the damage has gone so far that it can't be restored.
Right.
But I think action needs to take soon. I mean, take place soon. You know, we can't be waiting any longer. We've known this has been a problem for years.
We have.
And so it's just, it's time. It's now, we have to take some action.
Right. Your thoughts?
I think it's a critical point. I think that we've seen the problem for years. It's been identified. We know what risks we are taking by not being more aggressive in fixing the issues. And with the formation of the trustees of the Sandwich Beaches and the work of the Sandwich Beach Committee, I think the will is there. I think that's what's exciting right now, is that the people are coming together, the residents are rallying, and they're saying, we're going to start the process of getting this taken care of now. We're not going to wait for someone else to do it. And I think that's what's really exciting to me, Irene.
Thanks. I know that there have been people that have said, this is nature. You know, it's nature, and nature has its way of, you know, erosion is a natural process. But I agree with both of you that I think that while it is nature, there are things that we can do to help mitigate that. And when we do that, it's going to be good both for our environment and our business. I want to thank both of you for being here today and helping inform the public a little bit more about the impact of erosion on our community. Thank you.
Thank you.